Next, or rather simultaneously, it was time for the Cabal to take revenge on Russia, once again. Financed by their partner in crime, the Rothschilds, they started the Russian Revolution. Their pawn and frontman, Lenin. His real name, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Every historian will agree on the fact that Lenin was heavily influenced by Karl Marx, the founder of communism. But Marx wasn't Russian, he was German. Lenin was Russian, but as he spent many years in exile in Finland, Switzerland, England and Germany, he had become almost a stranger to Russia at the time the first part of the Russian Revolution broke out in February 1917. He was completely westernized. Marx had inspired him massively with his 1848 pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto. Lenin wasn't just inspired by Marxist communism, but also by his Jesuit background. Marx was trained in Germany at a Jesuit school, and after that he was tutored by Jesuits in the British Museum on the tenets of communism, as confirmed by ex-Jesuit priest Alberto Rivera. Another source of Marx being a Jesuit coadjutor, an assistant bishop, is Otto von Bismarck, who wrote in the North German Gazette that Marx was under control of the Jesuit priest Peter Becks, then Superior General of the Society of Jesus. And there was more Jesuit influence on Lenin. His right-hand man, Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the head of the Soviet secret police, was a great admirer of the Jesuits. Furthermore, Lenin formally readmitted the Jesuits into Russia in 1922, which is rather strange, as religion was prohibited at that time within communism. But then again, was it strange? The origin of communism lies in the Jesuit ideology, as confirmed by many historians. The Jesuits in the 17th and 18th centuries perfected the first system of communist governance in their reductions in Paraguay. In the New Advent Catholic Encyclopedia, it reads, on the conditions of property, the economic basis was a sort of communism. The land and all that stood upon it was the property of the community. The land was apportioned among the caciques, who allotted it to the families under them. Agricultural instruments and cattle were loaned from the common supply. No one was permitted to sell his plot of land or his house. Very communist indeed. We will see later on in this documentary that even the term social justice was invented by the Jesuits. The first man to name it and write about it was the Jesuit Luigi Tabarelli d'Azeglio. Lenin was a Jesuit puppet who was pushed forward by the Cabal to destabilize and destroy the country. He hated Russia and the Russians. Some of his most famous quotes are, "I spit on Russia. While the state exists, there can be no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state." And, "May 90% of the Russians die, and let the other 10% live under communism." The Russian Revolution was a Jesuit attack on the country. Their motive? Revenge. Their pawn? Lenin. Their tool? The Bolshevists. They were the equivalent of the Jacobins during the French Revolution. Millions of people died in Russia between 1917 and 1923, the year in which the Russian Revolution ended with the Bolshevist founding of the Soviet Union. Now, before we move on to World War II, where we will share with you a discovery that, quite frankly, knocked us off our feet, so keep watching, we will first take a look at a chain of events in the US. Maybe you remember from part 2 of the previous series, that in 1913 the US Federal Reserve Bank was founded, the mother of all banks, owned by several cabal families, among which the Rothschilds? Remember what happened to the three wealthiest and most influential opponents of the Fed? They conveniently died when the Titanic sank. Less than a year later, the Fed was a done deal. In the US at that time, about 21,000 banks did not yet fall under the jurisdiction of the Fed. That was, and still is, an absolute lethal thing to do. One might as well commit suicide, as history has proven over and over again, worldwide. In 1914, World War I started, 1 year after the establishment of the Federal Reserve. Between 1914 and 1919, the Fed doubled the money supply, causing a nationwide increase in lending. In 1920, it shrank the money supply, and 5,500 competitor banks went bankrupt. They were bought by the Fed for next to nothing. Between 1921 and 1929, the Fed increased the money supply again. Loans were everywhere. But on October 23, 1929, 2.6 million shares were sold in a frenzy. By whom? Not that hard to guess. The next day, on October 24 at 9 a.m., Wall Street was closed, and the moneymakers who had gathered outside slowly started to realize in a state of shock what had happened. Loans were called in. Investors were forced to sell their shares. This event became known in history as the Wall Street crash. The Wall Street crash brought the rest of the world on its knees too. 16,000 competitive non-Fed banks went bankrupt. They too were bought for next to nothing. It was called the greatest robbery in history. But it wasn't enough. The Fed reduced the money supply even further by 30%, causing starvation throughout the US. The Rothschilds had done what they had successfully been doing since the French Revolution, manipulating the stock market at the expense of the people to further increase their wealth and power. Congressman McFadden was so horrified he began impeachment proceedings against the bankers who owned the Federal Reserve. Like I said, he might as well have committed suicide straight away. He was poisoned at a banquet, and the impeachment was abandoned. One simply does not get in the way of the Khazarian cabal. 4 years after the Wall Street crash in 1933, on the pretext of getting out of the Depression, the banks persuaded the government to carry out a national gold seizure on penalty of imprisonment for 10 years. That's right. Under pressure of the Fed, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102 to make the impoverished American people give up their gold. They had nothing left. With the gold standard gone, the cabal had no more limitations on how they could manipulate the money supply. This meant absolute dominance. On top of everything else, income tax was created in 1913 to cover the huge amounts of money the government was paying the Federal Reserve. Like we said in part 2 of the previous series, income tax is illegal. We were just never told. One of the dire consequences of the Wall Street crash was that the Fed called in all international loans. The country that was the worst affected was Germany. After World War I, the country had to pay reparations to the victims, for which it desperately needed the loans, as well as for rebuilding the country and the economy. When the Fed called in their loans, the German economy collapsed. The country dived into a deep depression. That same winter, about 2 million people were unemployed. Less than 3 years later, that number had tripled, meaning a staggering unemployment rate of 40%. The government's expenses to support these people went through the roof. The Chancellor cancelled unemployment support in a desperate move, which made things even worse. More chancellors came and went. Nobody knew what to do with this mess. People were losing faith in democracy, music to the ears of the cabal, and sought help from extreme left, the communists, or extreme right, the Nazis. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Although he had a majority of seats in Parliament, he did not have the absolute power he desired. Conveniently, only 4 weeks later, the Reichstag, home of the German Parliament in Berlin, was set on fire, allegedly by communists. Hitler used the event to persuade President Hindenburg to pass an emergency act restricting personal liberty. The act abolished freedom of speech, assembly, privacy, and the press. It abolished the right to own property and the right to trial before imprisonment. It legalized phone tapping and interception of correspondence. The decree was used as the legal basis for the imprisonment of anyone considered to be opponents of the Nazis. People could be imprisoned for any or no reason. That night, around 4,000 people were arrested, imprisoned and tortured by the SA. Hitler was now able to imprison communist leaders, so his main opponent during the elections, the Communist Party, fell apart. Hitler's SA intimidated the rest of the opposition, after which he pushed through the Enabling Act that enabled him to make laws without the parliament's consent for the next 4 years. This gave Hitler absolute power. He then banned all political parties. Only the Nazi Party was allowed to exist. The final obstruction to absolute dictatorship was dealt with on June 30, 1934, called the Night of the Long Knives, when 400 SA members who were making demands were slaughtered by Hitler's SS. 1.5 months later, Hitler was in absolute control of Germany. He had become the Führer, meaning he was president, chancellor, and head of the army. Members of the armed forces had to swear a personal oath of allegiance, not to Germany, but to Hitler, which is so Jesuit. Remember the oath of absolute subservience and obedience to the Supreme General? Who was Hitler, really? Hitler came from an interesting family. His mother was Clara Pölzl. His father was Alois Hitler. Alois's mother is where things get really interesting. Her name was Maria Anna Schiggelgruber. She was a simple peasant girl from a village called Strons near Dollersheim. At the age of 42, still being single, she gave birth to Alois. At the time she conceived, September 1846, Maria lived in Vienna, where she worked as a servant for none other than Anselm Salomon von Rothschild. As soon as the family discovered her pregnancy, she was sent back home, where Alois was born. Maria refused to tell who the father was. It must have been someone with power, for she kept it a secret for the rest of her life and the father did not feel the need to marry her. When Alois was 5 years of age, Maria married Johann Georg Hitler. Even though many researchers believe he must have been Alois's biological father, he never acknowledged the boy as his own. It wasn't until Alois was 40 years old when he suddenly changed his surname from Schicklgruber to Hitler. Why wait so long if he was truly Hitler's son? That doesn't make sense at all. Alois married Clara Pölsel. It was his third marriage. They had 6 children, 4 of which died at a very young age. The only 2 surviving children were Adolf and his sister Paula. Nobody knows for sure who the biological father of Alois Hitler was. Several names have come forward: Leopold Frankenberger, Johann Nepomuk Hitler, Johann Georg Hitler's brother. But we found no real evidence for any of the above. They all seem to have been used as a decoy to take our attention away from Anselm Salomon von Rothschild. So, why do we believe it was Rothschild who impregnated Maria? Because of several indicators. First of all, 9 months before Alois's birth takes us to September 1836. According to the Rothschild archives in London, Maria worked as a maid for Anselm Salomon von Rothschild. Now there are 2 possible suspects of the rape of Maria. 1, Anselm, who was 33 years old at the time. 2, his father, Salomon Meyer von Rothschild, who was 72 at that time. Now the Rothschild archives contain handwritten correspondence between the son, Anselm, and the London Rothschild Bank, which proves he was in Vienna at the time of the conceived pregnancy. His father, on the other hand, was in Paris. That narrows it down, don't you think? Secondly, in 1876, when Alois was 40 years old, he suddenly inherited a large sum of money. From whom? There wasn't any money in the family. Anselm Salomon von Rothschild died a year and a half prior, the time needed to pass an estate through the probate court. It was the same time Alois suddenly changed his name to Hitler, remember? Was that just a coincidence, or was it a demand by the Rothschilds in order to receive the inheritance, so that he would not be traced back to the Rothschild bloodline? Now please bear in mind that officially the Rothschilds were Jewish. They were the Babylonian Khazars who converted to the Jewish faith under pressure of the Russian king. Call them fake Jews if you like, but to the outside world, Adolf Hitler's father was half Jewish. If this ever came to light, it would be one hell of a scandal. And so, all traces of the Führer Adolf Hitler leading to the Rothschilds had to be erased. In 1921, the Munich Post intercepted a pamphlet that circulated among the early members of Hitler's Nazi party, the NSDAP. The pamphlet's title was Adolf Hitler, Traitor. It dealt with the alleged Jewish blood in Hitler's veins. It accused Hitler of fronting for Jewish finances and for acting like a Jew himself. The Munich Post decided to publish the pamphlet. On the very day that Hitler became Chancellor, the Munich Post was ransacked and its editors and writers were sent off to concentration camps, where they were never heard from again. The Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss investigated Hitler's family origins on 2 occasions. The first investigation, published in 1932, determined that Hitler's father was illegitimate, born to a 42-year-old unmarried woman and an unknown father. The second investigation determined that Hitler's mother was employed as a domestic servant in the residence of Baron Rothschild of Vienna. Shortly after, Hitler ordered the assassination of Dollfuss in 1934. Adolf Hitler once told his nephew, William Patrick Hitler, These people must not know who I am. You must not know where I come from and which family I'm from. In an effort to erase any evidence that would lead Hitler back to the Rothschilds, not only were people murdered, but the entire village of Dollersheim, where Hitler's grandmother had come from, was completely destroyed on Hitler's orders. Adolf Hitler, the Führer, did not come out of nowhere. We believe he was a Rothschild, maybe an illegitimate one, but still. We saw in the previous series, in part 5, how the illegitimate James Alefantis Rothschild was pushed forward by the family to play a very important part in the US elite and their Pizzagate. Well, Adolf Hitler too was pushed forward the same way to influence the outcome of yet another cabal war. Hitler was a great admirer of the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola. He said, "I learned much from the order of the Jesuits. Until now, there has never been anything more grandiose on the earth than the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church. I transferred much of this organization into my own party." Hitler called Heinrich Himmler, the inventor and organizer of the Holocaust, the Reichsführer of the SS, and compared him to Ignatius of Loyola. The SS organization has been constituted by Himmler according to the principles of the Jesuit order. The regulations and the spiritual exercises prescribed by Ignatius of Loyola were the model Himmler tried to copy exactly. Himmler's title as Supreme Chief of the SS was to be the equivalent to the Jesuit general, and the whole structure and direction was a close imitation of the Catholic Church's hierarchical order. Absolute obedience was the supreme rule. Every order had to be executed without comment. Hitler presented himself as the solution to all problems. He offered jobs in the war and weapon industry. He got rid of everyone he blamed for Germany's problems. The Jews, the Gypsies, the Communists, the disabled, the homosexuals, and he confiscated all of their money. Hitler was supported by a highly efficient propaganda machine led by SSer Joseph Goebbels, who brainwashed the German people into believing that Hitler was some sort of a messiah and that the Jews were the cause of all evil. Well, we all know what happened. 85 million people died in World War II. But the cabal wasn't done just yet. As you might know, in the aftermath of World War II, hundreds of thousands of Jews emigrated to the promised land of Israel. But did you know that this migration had already been planned by the cabal in 1917? 22 years before World War II even started, Palestine was given away, literally, by Arthur James Balfour, Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, on behalf of the British government. As if nothing more but a chess piece, a country with inhabitants was given away to, guess who? Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild. But wait a minute, 1917? The First World War hadn't even ended yet. So how on earth could they be talking about a home for the Jews? The Jewish genocide hadn't even started yet. We're talking about the Balfour Declaration, signed by Balfour himself on the 2nd of November 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Arthur James Balfour. Neither the Jews nor the Palestinians knew about this. It was yet another brilliant move of nothing but chess pieces by the cabal. What was presented as a benign action in favor of the Jews was, once again, a divide and conquer strategy. It could only end in yet another war, this time between Jews and Palestinians. The Jewish people were willingly and knowingly murdered 22 years after the Balfour Declaration was signed. Why? Because the Rothschilds and the other cabal families had but one focus: Jerusalem. It's not by chance that so many family members have Solomon in their name. The Temple of Solomon, Temple Mount, and therefore the land of Israel was their main priority. We will soon tell you why and expose their deepest and darkest secret. For now, millions of Jewish people were sacrificed in order to get there. There were many more wars to follow, like the Vietnam War, the Cold War. All were instigated and financed on both sides by the cabal. That's how people across the world were kept in fear, paralyzed and poor, divided and subservient. Once you understand and see their strategy, you cannot unsee it. But the worst was yet to come, for times were changing and the cabal adapted their strategy as time went along. Key words in their everlasting plan to conquer the world: hatred, revenge, disdain. These three words were perfectly combined in one document, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion,